A flash of blinding light fills the sky. 70,000 civilians living in Hiroshima are killed in an instant. In the years to come, 70,000 more will die from radiation poisoning. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, annihilating 40,000 men, women, and children. The United States has detonated the first and only atomic bombs ever used in a war, but in doing so, they may have saved millions of lives. Did the end justify the means? The answer to this question will make you sick to your stomach and question your morality. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces bombed Pearl Harbor. Bombs dropped from the sky, slamming into the hulls of U.S. naval ships. The Japanese frantically searched the waters for their main targets, but they were nowhere to be found. The goal of the attack on Pearl Harbor was to destroy the United States Pacific Fleet, and the only way to do that was to eliminate its aircraft carriers. However, several of the ships were not docked at the naval base at the time of the attack, as they were out on assignment in the Pacific. This included 3 aircraft carriers that the Japanese were hoping to destroy. Over 2,400 Americans lost their lives during the surprise attack. From that point on, most of the American population wanted revenge for the men lost at Pearl Harbor. In fact, this single moment in history would set in motion events that would result in the deaths of millions over the course of 3.5 years. After entering World War II in the Pacific, the United States was forced to play a deadly game of cat and mouse with Japan. Their armies hopped from one island to the next, costing men and resources. The goal of each side was to control as much of the Pacific waters as possible. For the United States, it was a matter of maintaining a foothold in the region to launch attacks on Japan's main island and end the war. For the Japanese, it was a battle to keep control of their power and force the United States back across the Pacific to their mainland. There were massive amounts of casualties on both sides. Civilians that inhabited the islands of the Pacific and East Asia were caught up in a war they had no desire to be in. Unfortunately, they did not have the power to stop the two nations from ravaging their homelands. Neither side would back down, so drastic decisions needed to be made. The decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan started with the most bloody conflict in the Pacific, the Battle for Okinawa. U.S. forces made their way closer and closer to Japan. The Japanese knew that if they lost Okinawa, an invasion of their homeland was imminent. Each side had everything to lose when the battle started. The U.S. codenamed the incursion of Okinawa Operation Iceberg. On April 1, 1945, the United States launched the largest amphibious assault in the history of the Pacific Theater. Boats and amphibious vehicles cruised through the water loaded with soldiers. When they reached the shores of the island, the ramps lowered and Marines flooded onto the beaches. They immediately met heavy resistance. The Imperial Japanese Army already had a stronghold on the island, and they would not give up so easily. In fact, the Japanese would rather fight to the very last man than surrender this strategic location. The main objective for U.S. forces was to take Kadena Air Base, which would serve then as a launching point for Operation Downfall, the name given to the invasion of Japan. Thousands of Allied ships, planes, and vehicles carried out attacks across the island, but the Japanese were dug in and ready. They launched kamikaze counteroffensive and made sure to strike key targets to slow the Allied advance. It was a bloodbath for both sides. The Battle of Okinawa resulted in the highest number of casualties of any battle in the Pacific. It's estimated that somewhere around 160,000 military personnel died while fighting for control of the island. The United States lost close to 50,000 men, while Japan lost somewhere between 80,000 and 115,000 people. The saddest part is that the biggest loss of life was for the Okinawans themselves. Nearly half of the 300,000 people who lived on the island before the attack died during the battle. Some were forced to enlist in the Japanese army, while others were innocent victims caught in the firefights and bombings that took place across the island. After months of fighting, the United States secured victory on the island and gained control of the airfield. However, even once the majority of Japanese forces were defeated, the Americans still had to contend with guerrilla fighters and small Japanese units sprinkled around the island. They would hide in the forests and sabotage U.S. operations whenever an opportunity presented itself. Patrols often found themselves being ambushed out of nowhere as they let their guard down thinking the enemy threat had been dealt with. In fact, some Japanese soldiers never received word that the war had ended and continued fighting for many years after Japan surrendered and World War II was officially over. The loss of life and military assets during the Battle of Okinawa gave U.S. intelligence pause. If the Japanese were able to inflict such damage on a small piece of land hundreds of miles away from their main island, what would it cost Allied forces if they were to invade Japan itself? The loss of life would be unimaginable, and it was hypothesized that it would take years to finally subdue Japanese forces. If there was another way to force Japan into surrendering, the U.S. needed to find it quickly. As the Battle of Okinawa raged on in the Pacific, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died of an intracerebral hemorrhage in the brain on April 12, 1945. Harry Truman was sworn into office as the next president of the United States and immediately started making difficult decisions about the war in the Pacific. After word reached Truman that Okinawa had been secured at great cost, he tasked his advisors with finding a way to force Japan to surrender, and he wanted it done with minimal U.S. casualties. Unfortunately, at the time, there was no good option. It had become clear Emperor Hirohito would not submit willingly. In fact, everyone in Japan believed that they would win the war and were willing to lay down their lives to make sure it happened. Men, women, and children, military, civilian, elderly, all Japanese citizens would rather have died than surrender their country to a foreign power. This meant that regardless of what Truman decided to do, lives would be lost. The question was just how many people needed to die in order for World War II to come to a close. Soon after the transition of power from Roosevelt to Truman, the new president was made aware of a top-secret weapon that was being developed by scientists in Los Alamos, New Mexico. It was known as the Manhattan Project, named after the location of the team's first office in New York City, and would result in the world's first atomic bomb. After the successful test of the first nuclear bomb ever created on July 16, 1945 at Alamogordo bombing range, Truman believed that the atomic bomb could be his only way to force Japan into surrendering. Truman asked a committee of advisors led by the Secretary of War Henry Stimson to determine if using the atomic bomb on Japan was the best course of action to end the bloody war. After seeing the devastating effects of the nuclear explosion, the committee did not take this task lightly. They knew that if the U.S. detonated an atomic bomb on Japanese soil, the civilian casualties would be immense, but it was determined that an invasion of Japan would be even more costly for both sides. Most of the committee concluded that the bomb should be used. Stimson was a huge advocate that this was the right decision. So under the advisement of the committee, President Harry Truman issued the Potsdam Declaration on July 26, 1945, which called for the unconditional surrender of Japan. Truman warned that if the Japanese emperor did not comply, there would be prompt and utter destruction. There was no way that the Japanese leaders could have known what Truman was talking about, as they had never seen a nuclear explosion before or even knew that such a bomb existed. This is one of the main problems with trying to justify using the atomic bomb. The Potsdam Declaration would have been outrageous to the Japanese emperor and his advisors. They knew that if the United States invaded their island, they could depend on the masses to fight until the very last person fell. The Japanese people would not give up their homeland to an invading enemy, and the Japanese leadership was pretty confident that they could cause enough casualties to the Allied forces that at the very worst they'd end up negotiating a truce. This would allow Japan to make a few demands of their own, such as maintaining control of the country. However, this was not an option for the Allied forces. They would not negotiate. It was either unconditional surrender by Japan or nothing. When Truman did not receive a reply from Emperor Hirohito, he gave the order to drop the bomb. On August 6, 1945, a Boeing B-29 called Enola Gay took off from an airfield on Tinian Island. In its cargo hold was Little Boy, the first atomic bomb ever to be used in a war. At 8:15 a.m., the Enola Gay spotted Hiroshima. The crew prepared to drop the bomb and get the hell out of Dodge before it detonated. The signal was given, red lights flashed as the bomb bay doors opened. Little Boy was dropped 31,000 feet above the city of Hiroshima. 44 seconds later, there was a bright flash as the atomic bomb detonated 1,500 feet before hitting the ground. Approximately 70,000 people were instantly incinerated by the blast. The Japanese finally found out what Truman meant by prompt and utter destruction. It's unclear what exactly was being discussed by the Japanese leadership immediately after the bomb was dropped, but when no declaration of surrender came, 3 days after Hiroshima was bombed, the U.S. decided to try again. On August 9, 1945, a different B-29 named Boxcar carried a second larger atomic bomb named Fat Man toward Nagasaki. The bomb was dropped and the instant it detonated, 40,000 more Japanese civilian and military personnel were consumed in the fiery blast. Both Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been wiped off the face of the planet by the atomic bombs. Japan was now ready to surrender. Talks between Japanese leadership and the United States began, and on September 2, 1945, Japan officially signed documents of surrender on board the USS Missouri. The question is, was the use of the atomic bomb justified by the United States? Was there another way to convince Japan to surrender? Or did tens of thousands of Japanese civilians need to die? We'll present you with evidence for both sides of the argument, but you will ultimately have to decide for yourself. You may be surprised at which side you choose. After the atomic bombs were dropped and the United States occupied Japan, some shocking information was discovered about Japan's plans for ending the war. According to Japanese military officers and soldiers, they knew where the U.S. invasion was going to land and had already begun preparing to inflict as much damage as possible to their forces. Their orders were to repel Allied forces for as long as possible and inflict casualties by any means necessary. Most of the Japanese military strategists knew that they would not be able to stop the invasion, but it was also known that the island's entire population would fight until they were all killed. Surrender was not an option for the Japanese people, and they believed that it was better to die fighting than to lose their homeland to the invading force. Knowing this, U.S. military leaders were convinced that they had made the right decision. There were over 70 million people who lived on the island, and it was predicted that everyone from children to grandmas would do their part to stop the invading Allied forces. This included makeshift kamikaze runs by civilians using grenades or other explosives. The carnage would have been unfathomable. Therefore, by detonating the atomic bombs, the military concluded that tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers' lives were saved, along with millions of Japanese lives. Another argument to justify the use of the atomic bomb is that war itself is inhumane. The bombs dropped on Japan helped end World War II, and therefore it was the right call. To put it into perspective, in March of 1945, the United States dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo. This caused massive fires to sweep across the city and consume everything in their path, including civilians. It's estimated that well over 100,000 people were killed in Tokyo bombings. So, was this any better than dropping an atomic bomb? Long-term effects of both situations are different. Over 1 million people lost their homes in the Tokyo bombing, but those who survived did not need to worry about radiation poisoning and cancer like the survivors of the atomic bomb blasts. A home can be rebuilt, but death by radiation cannot be avoided. It was also estimated by General MacArthur that even if the Japanese government was forced to surrender after the invasion, there would still be countless guerrilla groups that would hide in the forests and mountains on the island that would need to be dealt with. They would continuously wreak havoc on U.S. installations and oppose the new government that would be put in place. MacArthur concluded that it would take 1 million U.S. troops 10 years to deal with the rogue Japanese soldiers. At that point, the war might have been over on paper, but the battle would still continue for U.S. soldiers stationed in Japan. It's also important to note that many Japanese people still thought they could win the war even after the atomic bombs were dropped. The emperor himself needed to declare the war over, or the people of Japan would keep on fighting. The atomic bombs forced the Japanese leadership to concede and to tell their citizens they had lost the war and it was now time for peace. This led to several civilian and military groups taking up arms and revolting against their own government, as they believed there should be no surrender. But these attempts to overthrow the government were put down by the Japanese military, and the unconditional surrender commenced. A less strong argument for using the atomic bomb, yet one that Harry Truman used after he left office, was that Japan started it. This might sound childish, but many Americans wanted revenge for what the Japanese did at Pearl Harbor. In 1958, the City Council of Hiroshima passed a resolution condemning Truman for ordering the atomic bomb to be dropped on their city. Truman responded that he did not blame the council for condemning what he did, but he claimed the United States had been shot in the back, referencing the attack at Pearl Harbor. He concluded in his letter back to the council that the atomic bomb saved hundreds of thousands of American and Japanese lives. Therefore, it was justified. Some historians think that the American people would have forced Truman to use the atomic bomb even if he had decided not to initially. As more and more American soldiers died in the war and information about the successful test of a nuclear bomb in New Mexico got out, the public would have pressured Truman to use the new weapon of mass destruction, or they would be happy to elect someone in the office who would. It's hotly debated whether demonstrating the capability of the atomic bomb by dropping it on an uninhabited piece of land for the Japanese to see would have been enough to cause them to surrender. Many scientists in Truman's initial committee of advisors believed that this show of force would indeed have been enough. However, the military personnel felt differently. The Japanese people were so invested in the war that merely demonstrating the atomic bomb's potential might have been seen as an empty threat. Therefore, it was concluded that the bomb must be dropped on a city that had military significance. The decision of which cities to bomb did not fall to Truman but to military leaders. Both Hiroshima and Nagasaki were chosen because they had military manufacturing facilities. However, this does beg the question, why couldn't the bomb just have been dropped on a military facility away from any major cities? There were plenty of Japanese bases that were isolated from civilian populations. So why couldn't one of those have been the target? This question has also been debated over the decades without any clear answer as to why hitting a military base couldn't have been tried first. That brings us to an unsettling idea. Maybe dropping the atomic bombs on 2 Japanese cities was not justified. The main reason why many believe that dropping the atomic bombs was unethical is that the U.S. military intentionally targeted civilian populations. Many believe that the United States used terrorist-like tactics to force the Japanese government to surrender. Even current military ethics courses in the United States make justifying the dropping of atomic bombs difficult. When tough decisions need to be made during war, and collateral damage is inevitable, the proportionality of benefit to cost needs to be weighted. It's agreed upon by many military officials and historians today that the destruction of military targets at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was nowhere near proportionate to the loss of civilian life. This makes dropping the bombs on these cities an unjustifiable choice. For people who think dropping the atomic bomb was necessary, but a military target should have been chosen, it's often cited that the bomb should have been dropped in the southern part of Kyushu. It was here where Japanese troops were massing to mount a defense against U.S. invasion. Not only would this have been a strategic significance, but it would have minimized the civilian casualties by targeting an area that was mostly filled with military personnel. And although some believe that dropping a demonstration bomb wouldn't have resulted in Japan surrendering, not everyone sees it this way. If the United States had detonated a bomb where high-ranking Japanese officers could see it, it's very plausible they would recommend to the emperor that peace talks should begin immediately. Also, if a demonstration didn't work, the next option still wouldn't have been to blow up a city full of civilians, as they could have tried dropping a bomb on a military base first. But the fact that the first target was a densely populated city where 70,000 people were obliterated by a single bomb seems like an extreme first choice when there were other more justifiable options. Many historians also believe that if a demonstration atomic bomb was used, the Emperor of Japan would have been willing to enter negotiations, although it's probable the US would have refused this option as they wanted Japan's unconditional surrender. But it's been argued that if the United States had been willing to negotiate, Japan would have come to the table after an atomic bomb demonstration. In fact, even without a demonstration, it's thought that most high-ranking officials in the military and government already knew the war was lost, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that if the United States had been willing to let Emperor Hirohito stay in power, Japan would have surrendered. This would have been possible without the mass murder of over 100,000 civilians by atomic bombs. But there was another factor that would have almost certainly led to the surrender of Japan. It had nothing to do with nuclear explosions or the United States. Instead, at the same time the US was dropping its second atom bomb, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. There was no way that Japan could have defeated both the US and Allied forces in the Pacific, as well as the Soviet Union advancing from the West. Japan knew this, and it's very plausible that if the United States had waited for the Soviet Union to declare war on Japan, they would have never had to drop the atomic bombs in the first place. Japan's plan at the time was to cause enough American losses that they would have been forced to negotiate a settlement. The average Japanese citizen and soldier might have believed that Japan could still win the war, but the leadership was not under the same delusion. They were just weighing their options and trying to figure out the best outcome. However, once the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, it was only a matter of time before they became overwhelmed on multiple fronts. As soon as the Soviet Union joined the battle, they steamrolled their way through Japanese lines in Manchuria and pushed deeper and deeper into Japanese-controlled territories. Once this happened, Japan would have likely sought out a deal with the US, even if it hadn't dropped the atomic bombs. The reason for this is because Japan already knew that if the Soviets invaded, it would have been a very different type of occupation than if the United States was in charge. Japan likely already had information about the way that occupied territories in Europe were being treated by the Allies versus the Soviets. The Soviets did not have the best reputation. They tended to incorporate territories into the Soviet Union and then brutally strip them of their national identity. Knowing this, Japan might have seen the occupation by the United States as a better option if they were to surrender. And since the Soviets were closing in quickly, Japan might have reached out to the US and surrendered even if the atom bombs hadn't been dropped. And if this is the case, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not justified at all. There is no doubt at the time that the majority of the American public believed using the atomic bomb was completely justified. In fact, a Gallup poll that was conducted almost immediately after the bombs were dropped in 1945 found that 85% of Americans approved of the decision. This is a huge amount of support, which might be why Truman felt pressure to give the order. It's important to remember that although Truman authorized the use of atomic weapons, a committee of military personnel made the decision of where to strike. In a Pew study conducted in the last several years, the sentiment of the American people has changed drastically about the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, only around 50% of the US citizens believe it was justified. There are probably several reasons for this. For one, many of the people who were alive during World War II and were impacted by Pearl Harbor are no longer with us. People who are further removed from such a tragic event tend to have less emotional investment and therefore might think more critically about a decision that cost the lives of over 100,000 civilians. We also now know much more about the long-term effects that nuclear weapons can have on people and the terrible diseases that can result from radiation poisoning. Many individuals don't think anything justifies killing so many civilians, even during a world war. This is especially true since there were other options besides dropping the atomic bombs on heavily populated cities. There are arguments to be made for both sides of the atomic bomb debate, but there are a few undeniable facts. The United States targeted cities with civilians when they had the option of demonstrating the power of the atomic bomb on uninhabited land or against strictly military personnel. The Japanese were also probably willing to sit down for peace talks even without the bombs being dropped, especially after the Soviet Union declared war on them. All that being said, the atomic bombs definitely played a major role in forcing Japan to surrender and ending World War II. If the United States had invaded the main island of Japan, many more people would have died than perished as a result of the atomic bombs. And this does not necessarily justify the use of atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it does make you think if it was the best option in a really bad situation.